The city never truly sleeps. Beneath the towering skyline of glass and steel, where the wealthy sip champagne on their balconies, the streets below tell a different story. A story of struggle, a story of survival, and sometimes a story of redemption in the most unexpected places. Jonathan Hayes had everything most people could only dream of. Billions in his bank account, a penthouse that overlooked the entire city, and a name that commanded respect in the world of business. But in all his success, there was something missing. Not that he'd admit it. Jonathan wasn't the type to dwell on emotions. Money solved everything. At least, that's what he believed. One late evening, after a high-stakes meeting that secured him yet another massive deal, Jonathan walked out of an upscale restaurant. His expensive leather shoes clicked against the pavement as he headed toward his car, his mind already occupied with the next big thing. But then, he saw her, a woman, sat on the cold concrete, wrapped in layers of old clothing that barely kept out the chill. A tattered beanie covered most of her hair, and her face, though worn and tired, held a strange sense of calm. She wasn't begging. She wasn't even looking up at people passing by. She simply sat there, watching the world with quiet eyes, as if she knew something the rest of them didn't. Jonathan had seen plenty of homeless people before. To him, they were just part of the city's backdrop. An unfortunate reality, but not his concern. Yet for reasons he couldn't quite understand, he hesitated. Something about her felt different. "Spare some change, sir." A man further down the sidewalk called out, breaking Jonathan's thoughts. He shook his head and continued walking. But just as he was about to step into his car, the woman spoke. "It's funny, isn't it?" Her voice was soft but steady, carrying an air of knowing. "You have everything in the world, yet you still look lost." Jonathan froze. He turned slowly, his sharp businessman instincts kicking in. "Excuse me?" he asked, slightly taken aback. She didn't look at him, just continued watching the streetlights flicker against the dark sky. "Nothing," she said with a small smile. "Just an observation." He should have ignored her. He should have just driven off. But something about her words got under his skin. How could someone who had nothing make a judgment about someone like him? Lost? He let out a short laugh. "Lady, I could buy this entire block if I wanted to. I think I know exactly where I am." She finally turned to face him, and for the first time, Jonathan noticed her eyes. There was something in them. Something deep, almost haunting. Not the kind of emptiness he expected, but wisdom. "Experience. Do you?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. Jonathan felt an unexpected irritation bubbling inside him. Who did she think she was? Some street philosopher? He had built an empire. From nothing. He didn't need life advice from someone who didn't even have a roof over her head. Still, against his better judgment, he stayed. "All right," he said, crossing his arms. "You seem to think you know so much. What exactly do you think I'm missing?" She studied him for a moment before answering. "That depends," she said. "How much are you willing to see?" Jonathan smirked, shaking his head. "I don't have time for riddles." "Then you don't have time for the truth." Her words hit harder than he expected. He had spent his life closing deals, crushing competition, and proving that money was the ultimate measure of success. Yet standing there in front of this woman, this complete stranger, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. A sense of doubt. Who was she? Why did she speak like she knew him? "Fine," he said, exhaling sharply. "You want to talk about truth? Let's hear it. What's your big secret?" For the first time, her expression changed. The calmness in her eyes wavered just slightly, as if she was debating whether or not to say more. Then, After a long pause, she finally spoke. "I wasn't always here." Jonathan frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" She looked away, staring at the distant glow of the city skyline. "I had a life before this. A name, a home, everything you think matters." There was something in her voice, something real, and for the first time that night, Jonathan felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation. Curiosity. Who was she? What had happened to her? Before he could ask, she gave him one last look and said something that sent a chill down his spine. "Money doesn't stop life from happening to you. You'd be surprised how quickly it can all change." Then, without another word, she stood up and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the city. Jonathan watched her go, an uneasy feeling settling in his chest. He didn't know why, but he had the strange sense that their conversation wasn't over, and he was right, because that woman, she was about to change his life in ways he never could have imagined. Jonathan couldn't shake the woman's words from his mind, even as he sat in the back seat of his luxury car, glancing at his reflection in the tinted window. The unease remained. He had met thousands of people in his life, executives, investors, politicians, people who spoke in calculated words, who played the same game he did. But she wasn't like any of them. She wasn't trying to impress him, convince him, or ask for anything. That was what unsettled him the most. Over the next few days, he tried to push the encounter out of his thoughts, drowning himself in work, in numbers, in the endless cycle of wealth building. Yet, no matter how many meetings he attended, how many deals he closed, his mind kept circling back to her, the woman with the haunting eyes, the woman who spoke like she had known him forever. One evening, as he sat alone in his penthouse, staring out at the glittering skyline, he made a decision. He had to see her again, not because he believed in fate or destiny. He wasn't one for that kind of nonsense, but because something about her didn't add up. She had said she wasn't always living on the streets. That meant she had a past, a story, and Jonathan hated loose ends. The next night, he found himself back on the same street where they had met. The sidewalks were alive with movement, people rushing home, taxis honking, the scent of food vendors lingering in the air. He scanned the area, expecting to find her sitting in the same spot. But she wasn't there. He waited. Minutes turned into an hour. Just as he was about to give up, he spotted her. She was walking slowly down the sidewalk, carrying a small worn-out backpack, her steps steady, but without purpose. Jonathan took a breath and approached her. "You disappeared," he said, stepping in her path. She looked up at him, unsurprised. "I didn't realize I had to check in with you," she said, her lips curling slightly. Jonathan smirked. "I just have some questions." She raised an eyebrow. "Rich man like you has questions for someone like me. That's new." Jonathan ignored the comment. "You said you weren't always here. What did you mean?" She studied him for a moment, as if deciding whether or not to answer. Then, she sighed and walked over to a nearby bench. Jonathan hesitated before following. "My name was Evelyn," she said finally, her voice softer now. Before all this, Jonathan frowned. "Was?" She nodded, clasping her hands together. "I was someone else before. I had a career, a home, a life people would have envied." She paused, looking up at the stars, barely visible through the city haze. Then one day, it was all gone. Jonathan didn't know why, but he felt a strange pull toward her words. "How?" Evelyn hesitated, then gave a bitter smile. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." "Try me," she sighed, shaking her head. "It started with trust," she said, her voice heavy. "Trusting the wrong people. Believing in the illusion that things last forever." Jonathan crossed his arms, waiting. I was married once, she said after a long pause, to a man who made promises, who said all the right things. Her fingers tightened around the fabric of her sleeve. We built a life together, a good one, at least I thought so. Jonathan had seen enough betrayals in his world to recognize where this was going. And then, Evelyn's jaw clenched. Then, I found out he had been lying to me for years. He wasn't just keeping secrets. He was setting me up to take the fall for his mistakes. Her voice was steady, but Jonathan could hear the undercurrent of pain beneath it. By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late. The business we built together, gone. The money, frozen. He disappeared. And I was left with nothing but debt. And a ruined name. Jonathan frowned. You didn't fight back. Evelyn let out a short, humorless laugh. Fight back? Against a system that favors the powerful? Against people who had already decided I was guilty before I could even speak. She shook her head. I tried, but doors shut. Friends vanished, and the world moved on. Jonathan had seen it before. How quickly people could turn. How loyalty often had a price. But there was something about Evelyn's story that felt different. More personal. Why tell me this? He asked finally. Evelyn looked at him. Her expression, unreadable. Because you remind me of him, she said. Not in the way you think, but in the way you carry yourself. Always in control. Always believing you have the upper hand. She tilted her head. But I wonder, have you ever lost? Jonathan stiffened. He didn't answer. Evelyn gave a small, knowing smile. That's what I thought. Jonathan exhaled sharply. You think I'm like your husband? No, she said, shaking her head. Not yet. Jonathan didn't know why, but her words unsettled him. He prided himself on his intelligence, his ability to read people. But with Evelyn, he felt like he was the one being studied. What do you want? He asked. Evelyn looked at him for a long time before answering. Nothing, she said finally. I just wanted to see if you'd come back. Jonathan frowned. Why? Because if you did, she said, standing up, it means you're starting to ask yourself the right questions. She slung her backpack over her shoulder. And that's how it starts. Jonathan watched as she walked away again, disappearing, into the city night. He didn't know what she meant, not fully. But he had a feeling he was about to find out, and something told him he wasn't ready for it. Jonathan wasn't sure why he kept thinking about Evelyn. Maybe it was because she had left him with more questions than answers. Or maybe it was because, for the first time in years, someone had looked right through him, not at his wealth, his success, or his reputation, but at something deeper, something he wasn't even sure existed anymore. A week passed, and life continued. As usual, meetings, deals, dinners with people who only spoke in numbers and profits. Yet, no matter how much he tried to lose himself in his world, Evelyn's words echoed in his mind. Have you ever lost? One evening, after yet another business event, he found himself driving through the same part of the city where he had met her. He wasn't even sure what he was looking for. Maybe closure. Maybe proof that she was just another person with a tragic past. Nothing more. But as he scanned the sidewalks, he realized she wasn't there. Something felt wrong. He wasn't sure why, but a sense of urgency pushed him to search for her. He checked alleyways, parks, even the rundown shelters nearby. And then finally, he found someone who recognized her. Evelyn? Yeah, I've seen her around. An older man sitting on the curb said, but she's not doing too well. Think she's been sick. Some of us tried to help, but you know how it is. Ain't much. We can do. Jonathan felt a weight settle in his chest. He wasn't used to feeling this kind of concern, especially not for someone he barely knew. But before he could second-guess himself, he asked where she might be. It took him another hour to find her. She was sitting against a brick wall in a deserted part of the street, her back resting against her worn-out backpack. She looked pale, weaker than before, her breath coming out in uneven gasps. "Evelyn," he said, kneeling beside her. She blinked up at him, her eyes hazy with exhaustion. "Back again," she murmured, trying to smile. "Didn't think you were the type to chase ghosts." Jonathan frowned. "You need help." "I'll be fine," she said, but the way she struggled to even sit up told a different story. Without another word, he helped her to her feet and, despite her weak protests, guided her to his car. It was the first time in a long time that Jonathan didn't think about the consequences, about what made sense. He just knew that walking away wasn't an option. At the hospital, Evelyn was diagnosed with pneumonia. The doctors said if she had stayed on the streets much longer, she might not have made it. Jonathan sat beside her hospital bed, waiting, thinking. And when she finally woke up, her voice was quieter than before. "You didn't have to do this," she said. Jonathan let out a breath, shaking his head. "I know." Evelyn studied him for a moment before giving a small nod. "So, what now?" Jonathan wasn't sure how to answer. All his life, he had operated with clear goals, strategies, numbers that made sense. But sitting here in this hospital room, none of that mattered. "I don't know," he admitted. Evelyn smiled, tired but real. "That's a good place to start." Over the next few weeks, Jonathan helped Evelyn find a way off the streets. It wasn't easy. She was hesitant at first, reluctant to accept anything from him. But little by little, she let her guard down. And in return, she taught Jonathan things he had never considered. About people, about loss, about the things money couldn't fix. One evening, as they sat on a park bench overlooking the city skyline, Evelyn turned to him and asked, "Why did you really come back for me that night?" Jonathan thought for a long moment before answering. "Because you were right," he said finally. "I've never lost. Not the way you have. But I think I was still missing something." Evelyn nodded. "And now?" Jonathan looked at her, then at the city in front of them. For the first time, he didn't have an answer. And maybe that was okay. He smiled. Still figuring that out, Evelyn chuckled. "Welcome to the real world." As they sat there, two people from completely different worlds, a quiet understanding settled between them, not as a billionaire and a homeless woman, but as two people who had both, in their own ways, been lost and had somehow found each other.